Today we'll be starting with rectus sheath. So the diagram which you see here, this is the sagittal section of the rectus sheath. First of all, you should be knowing what is rectus sheath. So rectus sheath, it is basically an aponeurotic sheath which covers the rectus abdominis muscle. So this muscle which you see here, is this big muscle. This is the rectus abdominis muscle, and this is the rectus sheath, the anterior wall and the posterior wall. It covers the rectus abdominis muscle. So if we see rectus sheath, it is basically an aponeurotic sheath. It covers the rectus abdominis muscle and it has two walls, the anterior and the posterior wall. Okay, so now let's see the features of the anterior and the posterior wall. This one which you see here, this is the anterior wall, and here this one, this is the posterior wall. So if we check for the features of the anterior and the posterior wall, so anterior wall, first thing is that it is complete. It is attached to the muscle from end to end. If you see here, yeah, so it's attached to the muscle from end to end. So anterior wall is complete, whereas the posterior wall, here the line which I'm going to draw here, this one, this is actually the costal margin. Okay, this is the costal margin. Okay, so above the costal margin, you see the posterior wall of the rectus sheath is incomplete. Here these three are the fifth, sixth and seventh costal cartilage. They are the fifth, sixth and seventh costal cartilage. So above the costal margin, the posterior wall of rectus sheath is incomplete, whereas the anterior wall is complete. It is attached to the muscle from end to end. So anterior wall is complete, posterior wall is incomplete. Anterior wall, the composition is variable. Even for the posterior wall, the composition is variable. Then one more thing about the anterior wall is that it is firmly adherent to the rectus abdominis by tendinous intersections. So now if you see here, this is the anterior wall. So what the tendinous intersections, in the sense these things which you see here, here, these are nothing but the tendinous intersections. So that is how the anterior wall is closely adherent to this rectus abdominis muscle. Okay, but if you see the posterior wall is free from the rectus abdominis muscle. So anterior wall, it is firmly adherent by tendinous intersections, whereas the posterior wall, it is free from the rectus abdominis muscle. Okay, so these are the features of the anterior and the posterior wall. So now we know what is rectus sheath. It is an aponeurotic sheath. It covers the rectus abdominis muscle. It has two walls, anterior wall and posterior wall. We have seen the features of the anterior wall. It is complete. Its composition is variable. It is firmly adherent to the rectus abdominis muscle. Posterior wall, it is incomplete. Its composition is variable and it is free from the rectus abdominis muscle. So we saw the introduction, we saw the features of the anterior and posterior wall. Now we'll see the formation of rectus abdominis, which is very important. So we'll move on to the formation. So formation, we'll mainly discuss it this way. So here what you see, this is the costal margin, right? Now here, this line which I'm drawing here, this is nothing but the arcuate line which goes like this. Okay, so we will basically see the formation above the costal margin, between the costal margin and the arcuate line, that is here between the costal margin and the arcuate line, and then below the arcuate line. Okay, that's how we are going to study the formation. So here, so the formation, if you see here, okay, this one, this structure is name A. Over here, this is actually above the costal margin. So this one here, this is above the costal margin, So anteriorly it is formed by the external oblique aponeurosis. Here you can see this is the external oblique aponeurosis, and posteriorly it is formed by 5th, 6th and 7th costal cartilage. Okay. So above the costal margin, anteriorly it is formed by the external oblique aponeurosis, and posteriorly it is formed by the 5th, 6th and 7th costal cartilage. So now if we look into between the costal margin and the arcuate line. So here the figure B over here, this one, this is between the costal margin and the arcuate line. So here anteriorly it is formed by external oblique aponeurosis and anterior lamina of internal oblique aponeurosis. So it is formed by the external oblique aponeurosis and just a second, okay, aponeurosis and anterior lamina of the internal oblique aponeurosis. Okay, got to write aponeurosis. Okay, internal oblique aponeurosis. And then if we look posteriorly it is formed by the posterior lamina of the internal oblique aponeurosis and the transversus abdominis. Posterior lamina of the internal oblique aponeurosis and the transversus abdominis. Transversus abdominis. This is the posterior one. The rectus. Okay. So now we saw between the costal margin and the arcuate line. So now if we see below the arcuate line here, so anteriorly it is formed by all the three muscles: external oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis. And if you see here, internal oblique and transversus abdominis both are fused over here. They both fuse. Okay, and then posteriorly it just rests on the fascia transversalis. Okay, so below the arcuate line it is formed by the all the three muscles, that is the external oblique, internal oblique and transversus abdominis, and posteriorly it rests on the fascia transversalis. So now we looked at the formation as well. So now we look at the contents. What are the contents of the rectus sheath? Okay. So now if we look into the contents, first thing, muscles is the rectus abdominis and the pyramidalis. So rectus abdominis is as this big muscle over here, and pyramidalis is actually a small muscle which lies below the rectus abdominis. So in contents, the muscles are rectus abdominis and pyramidalis. Now if we look at the arteries, we have two arteries here, superior epigastric and inferior epigastric artery. So if you look into the figure over here, this one, right, which one you see here, superior epigastric artery, and here comes the inferior epigastric artery. So superior epigastric artery, it comes from the costal and xiphoid origins of the diaphragm. Okay, and then it comes and it supplies the rectus abdominis. And inferior epigastric artery, it comes from below the arcuate line, and both of them anastomose here. Sorry, both of them they anastomose here. And they supply the rectus abdominis. So these are the arteries. If we look at the veins, then they are the accompanying veins, that is superior epigastric venae comitatus and inferior epigastric venae comitatus. Then if we look at the nerves, so nerves include the lower 5 intercostal nerves and the subcostal nerves. Okay, so we're done with the contents. Now we'll just look at the functions of the rectus sheath. So functions mainly, yeah, here. So functions, it checks the bowing of the rectus muscle during contraction, and thus it increases the efficiency of the muscle. So first thing is it checks the bowing, and it increases the efficiency of the muscle. during the contraction, by checking the bowing during the contraction, and it as well maintains the strength of the anterior abdominal wall. So these two are some of the important functions of the rectus sheath. So we'll just revise briefly whatever we have covered today. So the first thing what we saw was this diagram of rectus sheath. So okay. So this is the diagram of rectus sheath. So first we saw that rectus sheath. What is rectus sheath? The introduction. It is an aponeurotic sheath. It covers the rectus abdominis. It has two walls, anterior and the posterior wall. Next we saw what is called the features of the anterior and the posterior wall. So coming to the features, anterior wall, it is complete. Posterior wall, it is complete. You know how. Anterior wall, it is attached to the muscle from end to end. Posterior wall, it's incomplete here, it's not attached. And then anterior wall and posterior wall, both composition is variable. Composition is variable for both. Then anterior wall, important feature, it is firmly adherent to rectus abdominis through tendinous intersections. And posterior wall, it is free from the rectus abdominis. Okay. So features we saw. Then we saw what is the formations, for how is rectus sheath formed. Okay, so above the costal margin, anteriorly external oblique aponeurosis, posteriorly 5th, 6th and 7th costal cartilage. Then between the costal margin and the arcuate line, anteriorly external oblique aponeurosis and anterior lamina of internal oblique aponeurosis. Posteriorly, posterior lamina of internal oblique aponeurosis and the transverse abdominis. Okay, and the transverse abdominis. So, and then now we go below the arcuate line. So below the arcuate line, it is formed by all the three muscles: the external oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis, and then posteriorly it rests on the fascia transversalis. So we saw the formation, and next we saw the contents. So among muscles, rectus abdominis and pyramidalis, arteries superior epigastric and inferior epigastric, both of them anastomose, and they supply the rectus abdominis muscle. Then nerves, we saw lower 5 intercostal nerves and the subcostal nerves. Then we saw the functions of the rectus sheath. First thing, it helps in bowing, and hence it increases the efficiency of the muscle during contraction, and then it maintains the strength of the anterior abdominal wall. So two important diagrams which you should keep in mind while answering rectus sheath is mainly the sagittal section of the rectus sheath, this one here, and the other diagram is this one, the formation of the rectus sheath. So here comes to an end our topic of the rectus sheath. So we are almost done. Yeah. So thank you, and thanks for watching the video.